Emily sat stiffly in her first-class seat, exhausted and drained, 7 months pregnant, longing for some relief on the flight from Seattle to Denver. The roar of the engine shook the cabin, the steady hum that should have been soothing, but her swollen belly pressed against her spine, causing sharp pain with each breath. She rubbed her stomach, feeling the relentless kicks of the baby, a small companion on this tiring journey. She had hesitated to fly this late in her pregnancy, but her husband insisted on her joining him for an urgent family matter. Knowing he would be waiting at the gate, she pressed on. The cabin buzzed with the sound of ice clinking in glasses and the hushed whispers of passengers exchanging small talk. Flight attendants glided down the aisle, handing out drinks and pristine white towels, their smiles trained and professional. Everything seemed deceptively calm, until a sharp stab of pain in Emily's lower back made her wince. She shifted, pulling the thin pillow behind her back, but to no avail. A different pillow might ease the pain. Spotting a flight attendant nearby, she raised her hand shakily. "Excuse me," Emily said, her voice soft but firm, "could I please have another pillow?" The attendant, Miss Carter, froze mid-step. Her name tag gleamed under the overhead light, and her cold, gray eyes scanned Emily as if she were a stain on the upholstery. Her lips curled into a condescending smile. "You already have one," she snapped, her voice loud enough to make people turn their heads. Emily flinched, a heat rising in her neck. "I know, but I'm pregnant and my back hurts so much. If there's a spare one, Miss Carter cut her off with a snort, slamming her tray down on the cart. "Oh, pregnant, huh? Guess that makes you the queen of first class." Before Emily could respond, the flight attendant grabbed a half-empty bottle of water from the tray and threw it directly at Emily's face. The cold liquid splashed across her cheek, soaking her blouse and dripping down her thighs. A gasp rippled through the cabin as passengers stared in shock, some whispering, others glaring at Miss Carter in disbelief. Emily sat there, dazed, water trickling down her chin, her hands trembling as she wiped her eyes. The humiliation was even worse than the pain in her back. She wasn't asking for a throne, just a damn pillow. Why did this woman think she could degrade her like this? It was incomprehensible. What Miss Carter didn't know was that Emily's husband owned all the planes in this fleet. And when they landed in Denver, the smug flight attendant would choke on every cruel word she dared to say. "First-class amenities are limited, ma'am," Miss Carter barked, her voice slicing through the plane's low hum like a whip. "We don't just hand out extra pillows because someone snaps their fingers." Her tone wasn't just dismissive, it was a deliberate jab, loud enough to humiliate Emily in front of everyone. Heads turned, passengers craning their necks to witness the standoff. Emily's face flushed bright red, the shame burning in her throat like a wildfire. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't need it," she replied, her voice steady, though it trembled at the edges. She was trying to put out the fire, but Miss Carter's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as if Emily's restraint was a personal insult. "Listen, I get that you're pregnant," Miss Carter retorted, her voice dripping with disdain, "but rules are rules. If I give you another pillow, I'd have to give one to every passenger who complains. It doesn't work that way." Emily gripped the armrest, her knuckles white. She wasn't asking for luxury, just a bit of relief for her aching back. Before she could react, another flight attendant, Sarah, stepped forward. Her chestnut hair was neatly pinned back, but her voice still quivered. "I think there might be some spare pillows in the back," she gently suggested, trying to mediate. Miss Carter turned to look at her, eyes blazing. "And I think I know my job, Sarah. We don't bend the rules for every sad story. Where does it stop?" Sarah clamped her mouth shut, retreating swiftly, silenced by the older woman's glare. Emily's chest tightened, rage simmering beneath her skin. Miss Carter's words weren't just harsh, they seemed personal, as though Emily's presence in first class had somehow offended her. Passengers continued to stare, but no one intervened. Some people avoided eye contact when she looked at them, pretending not to notice. Their silence was deeper than the poison of Miss Carter's cruelty. She wasn't wrong. She wasn't asking for the world, just a pillow. She lifted her phone, fingers shaking as she typed. "They won't give me a pillow. The flight attendant just humiliated me in front of everyone." She hit send, her heartbeat pounding. Moments later, her phone buzzed. "Who's this?" Emily glanced up. Miss Carter was still standing there, sipping coffee and laughing with another attendant, completely unaware, or uncaring. Swallowing hard, Emily typed again. "I don't know her name, but she just made a big mistake." Her jaw clenched as the humiliation sank deeper, twisting inside her. She wasn't one for drama, but being so blatantly dismissed, so easily, it felt like a slap in the face. She stared at her phone, waiting. Another message popped up. What's the flight number? Her fingers fluttered. Flight 456 from Seattle to Denver. There was no immediate response, but Emily knew her husband, James. He was calm, methodical, with a quiet strength that commanded attention. If he wanted the flight number, he had already put the pieces into place. She set her phone down, placing a hand on her stomach, trying to breathe slowly. She wouldn't let Miss Carter ruin this trip. She wouldn't let the humiliation define her. Ahead, Miss Carter poured more coffee, muttering as she glanced back at the first-class cabin. Sarah, still flustered, hesitated before speaking up. Miss Carter, I think she really needs that pillow. She isn't asking for much. Miss Carter mocked her, taking a slow sip. Oh please. You've seen her. Some people think the world owes them everything. Sarah's stomach twisted as she stood there, helpless, watching Miss Carter dismiss Emily with cold disdain. Some people just think they're more important than they really are, Miss Carter scoffed, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. She's in first class, Sarah snapped, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. That makes her important. Miss Carter rolled her eyes, unflinching. Whether it's first class or not, we still follow the policies here. No extra pillows like this is a soup kitchen. Sarah clenched her jaw, swallowing the retort burning on her tongue. She had worked under Miss Carter long enough to know the woman would never back down, would never admit fault. Arguing was like shouting into the void. With a scowl, Sarah stepped back, her fists clenched. Back at her seat, Emily's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. Stay put. I'll handle it. A small, understanding smile tugged at her lips. She didn't know the details of Julian's plan, now James in this retelling, but she knew Miss Carter was about to swallow every condescending word she'd uttered. Emily exhaled slowly, placing her phone down beside her. The message was short, but its weight was clear. This wasn't over. Miss Carter didn't know who she had just humiliated. She shifted in her seat, the dull ache in her back a constant reminder of the discomfort Miss Carter had carelessly ignored. The cabin hummed with tension, though Miss Carter seemed oblivious. Walking through first class with the same air of authority she always had. She checked the drink orders and flashed a forced smile, as if her earlier rudeness had evaporated into the air. Across the aisle, an older man in a bespoke suit, Mr. Calloway, now Mr. Thompson, cleared his throat, drawing Emily's attention. He fidgeted with his tie, his voice low and hesitant. I saw what happened earlier. Emily turned her head slightly, her face neutral, waiting for him to continue. The way she spoke to you wasn't right, he mumbled, a sense of guilt creeping into his words. I just wanted to say that. She studied him for a moment, noticing how he avoided her gaze. He hadn't said a word when it mattered, when Miss Carter's venom was lashing at her in real time. Now, after the moment had passed, he wanted forgiveness. Emily gave a small, polite nod. Thank you. He quickly nodded back, burying his face in his newspaper, pretending to read. She wasn't impressed by his courage after the fact. What bothered her wasn't just Miss Carter's cruelty, but the silence of everyone else. The passengers who had witnessed her humiliation and did nothing. Their indifference still lingered like an unpleasant aftertaste. Then the intercom crackled, interrupting the whispers in the cabin. Miss Carter, please report to the cockpit immediately. Miss Carter froze mid-step, her coffee cup shaking lightly in her hand. Emily's lips curved into a subtle smile. Here it was. Curious glances flicked across the passengers as Miss Carter adjusted her uniform and strode forward, her head held high with unshakable confidence. She had no idea that her reckoning was just around the corner. Emily leaned back in her seat, placing a hand on her stomach, a quiet certainty enveloping her. Whatever was happening in the cockpit, she knew the outcome. Miss Carter walked into the cockpit, her posture stiff with self-assurance. She had been a veteran flight attendant for years, brushing off passenger complaints as if she were dusting off the pristine fabric of her uniform. Perhaps this was just another routine matter, a seating issue or a VIP request. But as she entered, the air grew heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Captain Reeves sat calmly, his hands steady on the controls, his eyes fixed on the small screen where a video call blinked. On the other end was Elias Grant, now Marcus Reed, the airline's senior executive. Miss Carter gasped. A call mid-flight from the company? That wasn't standard procedure. Finally, Captain Reeves turned to her, his face a neutral mask. Miss Carter, would you like to explain yourself? Marcus Reed leaned forward on the screen, his voice cold and precise. The issue, Miss Carter, is a direct complaint from headquarters. A first-class passenger was mistreated on this flight. Can you explain yourself? Her spine stiffened. A complaint from higher-ups? That meant someone with serious clout had escalated the issue, and fast. Yet she remained calm. There must be some misunderstanding. I was just enforcing first-class policies. Reed's tone sharpened, cutting through her defense. Did you check her ticket before deciding she wasn't eligible for an extra pillow? Miss Carter swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. Captain Reeves sighed, his patience clearly waning. Answer the question. She hesitated for a second before regaining her composure. I checked. But I was ensuring fairness. If I make an exception for one person, others will expect the same. Reed's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence more condemning than any words. Then the bomb dropped. The woman you refused. Miss Carter's knees buckled as the name hit her like a punch to the chest. Emily Williams. The pregnant woman she had yelled at and humiliated in front of the entire first-class cabin was married to James Williams, the owner of the airline, a man who controlled her career with a mere flick of his pen. Her stomach not only dropped, but twisted violently, a wave of nausea rising so quickly that she had to grip the cockpit door to steady herself, her vision blurring at the edges. Captain Reeves leaned back in his chair, his eyes tracking every tremor that racked her, waiting for the realization to sink in deeper. Marcus Reed, the senior executive, didn't give her the luxury of that time. His voice sliced through the video screen, sharp and unforgiving. Do you know who her husband is? The cockpit fell silent, the air thick and heavy. Her pulse quickened, pounding in her ears. Her husband? She croaked, though the answer had already crept up her throat. James Williams, Reed said, each syllable a hammer. The owner of this airline. Time stopped. Her throat closed up, her breath shallow. She had humiliated the wife of the owner. Captain Reeves adjusted his headset with a tired sigh, his voice low but firm. Mr. Williams personally asked you to correct this misunderstanding right now. Reed's tone dropped, dark and threatening. And when this flight lands in Denver, Miss Carter, you will explain yourself to the company. Directly. Do you understand? Her face turned pale, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had chosen the wrong fight, horribly wrong. Yes. I understand, she managed to choke out, her voice barely audible. Captain Reeves nodded toward the door. Then go fix your mistake. Miss Carter turned, her legs trembling as though the floor might collapse beneath her. For the first time in her career, she had lost control. The walk back to the first-class cabin seemed endless, the narrow aisle like a glove lined with invisible eyes. Her palms were drenched in sweat, the engine noise buzzing in her ears, mocking her crumbling composure. The faint scent of brewed coffee lingered in the air, making her feel even more nauseous. As she entered first class, the change was immediate. The passengers who had seen her summoned to the cockpit now turned to watch her return, their eyes piercing through the cold armor she usually wore. The gossip had spread. Something was wrong and they wanted front-row seats to witness the fallout. Emily sat in her seat, her hands calmly folded on her pregnant belly, her face unreadable yet exuding a quiet strength. Miss Carter swallowed, trying to force out a professional, tight-lipped smile as she bent down to Emily's level. For the first time she was below a passenger, her self-esteem shattered. Mrs. Williams, she said, her voice low but loud enough for nearby ears to hear, it seems there has been a misunderstanding. I would like to personally offer you another pillow. Emily tilted her head, her gaze steady and unwavering. She didn't respond immediately, letting the silence drag on until it pressed down on Miss Carter like a physical weight. The flight attendant's heartbeat raced, her forced smile weakening. I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience, she added, her voice cracking with tension. Finally, Emily spoke, her tone calm but firm. You're saying it's a misunderstanding? Miss Carter nodded stiffly. Yes. Emily blinked once, her expression unchanged. I had a ticket. I'm sitting in the assigned seat. I requested a pillow, a simple, reasonable request, and you refused me. Publicly. A few passengers shifted, their attention sharpening. Miss Carter's throat dried up like sandpaper. She began, but Emily cut her off, her voice rising just enough to command the whole cabin. You didn't ask anyone else in first class if they were deserving of being here? Emily said, each word deliberate and sharp. You didn't ask the businessman across the aisle or the couple in 2C. You assumed I didn't belong here. Why? Miss Carter clenched her hands at her sides. She was used to giving orders, enforcing rules, but now she was the one being judged. The passengers no longer pretended not to hear. Some stared, others whispered behind their hands. Her authority was slipping away and she could feel it. Maybe I was wrong in my judgment, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Emily raised an eyebrow. A mistake, she repeated, her words dripping with quiet disbelief. Miss Carter shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her own words sinking in. Emily let the silence fall, then reached for her phone, quickly typing, "She's giving me a pillow. What should I do?" Moments later it buzzed with a reply, "Take it slow. Let her respond." Emily slowly set her phone down, her eyes locked on Miss Carter's. "I'll accept your apology," she said smoothly, "but first I want to know why you thought I didn't belong here." Miss Carter's lips parted, but no sound came out. The entire cabin was dead silent, all the passengers hanging on every second. She had been used to controlling the story, now she was the one being interrogated, exposed. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her mind scrambling for an escape that didn't exist. The silence stretched, suffocating her. Emily didn't move, didn't blink, her calm demeanor like an unshakable wall. Miss Carter swallowed, her voice weak. She began, but the words dissolved into nothing. She stood frozen, the weight of her actions crushing her. For the first time she had no answer, no defense. Just the clear realization that her career, her life as she knew it, hung in the balance in this moment. And Emily wasn't going to let her escape. Emily's voice cut through the noise of the plane like a knife, smooth and steady, yet full of unshakable power. "You thought that," she said, her voice low but sharp. "You saw me sitting here, and you decided I didn't belong here." Her words weren't loud, but they filled the first-class cabin, heavy and undeniable. Miss Carter felt a jolt, her skin tingling as cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Her chest tightened under Emily's unwavering gaze, calm, resolute, and relentless. Miss Carter started, her voice trembling, but Emily didn't let her finish. "You decided about me before you checked the manifest," Emily pressed, her voice still calm, each syllable deliberate. "And when I told you I belonged here, you didn't believe me. Why?" Miss Carter's mouth felt like sandpaper, the bitter truth coating her tongue. She had judged Emily, judged her based on a glance. A young, black, pregnant woman sitting in first class? To Miss Carter it didn't compute. Now that assumption burned in her throat like bile, blatant and ugly. Emily tilted her head, her voice dropping to an almost a whisper, but somehow carrying more impact. "If you're going to apologize, at least tell the truth." Miss Carter's stomach clenched. She wasn't used to this, being cornered, being stripped bare. For years she'd wielded her authority like a shield, her decisions unquestioned. But now, pinned by Emily's steady gaze, she had nowhere to hide. Her lips parted, wanting to lie. Something about policy, not prejudice, but Emily's sharp, knowing eyes killed the impulse. Her hand trembled as she managed a whispered admission. "I misjudged you." Emily didn't respond. She let the confession hang raw and exposed, forcing Miss Carter to choke on the silence. Around them the cabin crackled with tension. A woman a few rows back shifted in her seat, her leather purse squeaking. Across the aisle, a businessman stared intently at his laptop, jaw tight, pretending not to hear. A guy in a baseball cap smirked faintly, enjoying the show. Every glance, every rustle, spotlighted Miss Carter. With slow, deliberate grace, Emily rose, adjusting herself as if she owned the plane. She reached for her bag, her movements unhurried, almost regal, radiating control. Miss Carter flinched back, shrinking, her usual confidence crumbling to dust. Emily glided past her without a word, without a glance. Miss Carter's weak apology unworthy of a response. Emily returned to her seat, settling back and adjusting the pillow behind her, the very pillow she had fought to keep. Miss Carter stood frozen, mortified and small, her hands twitching at her sides. She had always been the one in charge, the one commanding respect. Now she felt like a ghost, powerless and fading. And deep inside, a cold dread whispered, "This is just the beginning." Stiffly, she turned and shuffled toward the galley, her hands clenched, nails digging into her palms. The first-class cabin had shifted, the air thicker, the balance tilted. She had ruled these aisles for years, her word law. Now each step felt like wading through mud. Passengers who had previously ignored the scene now glanced at her, some judgmental, others gleeful. No one was neutral anymore. They had all watched her fall. In the galley, Miss Carter gripped the counter, her breath shallow and uneven. The aroma of brewing coffee wafted in the air, mocking her attempts to regain her composure. Sarah, who had witnessed the entire exchange, stood nearby, stacking drink trays with silent precision. Miss Carter felt her gaze like needles. After a long, stifling silence, Sarah spoke, her voice soft but sharp. "That didn't go well, did it?" Miss Carter whirled to face her, her eyes flashing with desperate fury. "I don't need your commentary, Sarah." Sarah shrugged, a flicker of something, satisfaction, in her eyes. Not commentary, she said, her voice even but clear. Just stating a fact. Miss Carter snatched a napkin, scrubbing at the countertop with rough strokes, though her trembling hands betrayed her. Sarah paused, then leaned in slightly, her voice a near whisper. She handled that better than you did. Miss Carter stiffened, the napkin crumpling in her fist. Sarah's words cut deep, and she watched her reaction like a hawk before adding, I'm not saying I agree with how things went down, but you humiliated her in front of everyone. And now you're the one shaking. Miss Carter clenched her teeth. I was doing my job, she snapped, but the words rang hollow. Sarah tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Were you? Miss Carter tightened her grip, the napkin tearing under her fingers. She wanted to lash out, to tell Sarah to back off, but doubt gnawed at her. This time she wasn't sure she was right. Before she could retort, the in-flight phone rang, sharp and jarring like a gunshot in the cramped galley. Her stomach dropped. She knew who it was. Sarah stepped back, muttering, That'll be for you. Miss Carter swallowed, her throat tight as she reached for the phone. Her hand trembled as she pressed it to her ear, forcing her voice to be steady. This is Miss Carter. A deep, calm voice responded, each word cold and precise. This is James Williams. She gasped, her fingers tightening around the phone. James Williams, an executive whose name alone could silence a room, a man whose influence in the aviation world was the stuff of hushed legend. She had never spoken to him, never imagined she would have to. Now his voice, smooth, calm, and utterly menacing, filled her ear. She cleared her throat, trying to project an air of professionalism. Mr. Williams, I don't need introductions, James cut her off, his tone as hard as steel. I need an explanation. Her mind reeled, every excuse she'd ever used dissolving into static. Her pulse hammered in her ears. James continued, each word slow and deliberate. You're going to tell me why my pregnant wife was made to feel like she didn't belong in first class. Miss Carter's mouth opened, but panic had swallowed her words. His voice remained even, but it carried a threat, a weight that pressed on her chest. You have one job, Miss Carter, he said, his voice sharp and edged. One, to provide professional, equitable service to every passenger. Instead, you chose to single her out. I didn't mean to single her out, she stammered, floundering. I was just following company policy. A long silence stretched, thick with judgment. Then James exhaled, a short, controlled breath of disappointment. Tell me something, Miss Carter? His voice grew heavier, more oppressive. Did you check the first-class manifest before you questioned my wife's presence in that seat? Her fingers dug into the phone, her heart pounding. Yes or no, he pressed, allowing no room for evasion. Her stomach clenched. No, she whispered. Another silence, this one truly crushing. No, James echoed, the word like a hammer blow. You didn't? Because you didn't think you needed to. Miss Carter cringed, the galley walls closing in. She felt small and exposed. You didn't ask the businessman across from her for his ticket, James continued, his voice cutting. You didn't ask the older woman in 2C if she belonged in first class. You assumed, based on what you saw, that my wife didn't deserve to be there. His words hit her like a physical blow, stripping her bare. She had nothing left, no defenses, no excuses. She had judged Emily, and now James' voice made it clear. There would be no escaping the consequences. Miss Carter gritted her teeth as James' voice rang out through the phone, low and threatening. So I'll ask again. What made you decide that my wife, my pregnant wife, wasn't worthy of the same treatment as every other passenger in first class? Her throat constricted, a bitter lump of shame and fear choking her. She didn't need to say it aloud, the answer shattered in the silence. She had seen Emily, a young, black, pregnant woman, enter the first-class cabin, and assumed she didn't belong. A snap judgment. A career killer. I made a mistake, she whispered, her voice trembling, almost inaudible above the thrum of the jet engines slicing through the sky from Seattle to Denver. James didn't respond immediately. He let her words hang there, simmering, before his voice turned colder than the recycled cabin air. Yes, you did. Miss Carter squeezed her eyes shut, sweat beading on her forehead. 10 years of struggling to climb the ranks, of wielding her authority like a weapon, and now it was slipping through her fingers like sand. When this flight lands, James said, his voice even and implacable, you will be escorted off the plane for a full review. Your employment is under evaluation, and believe me, Miss Carter, you are not going to like what's coming. Her heart hammered against her ribs, cold sweat slicking her palms. Escorted off. Evaluated. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was a guillotine suspended over her career. And one more thing, James added, his words as sharp as a cutlass. Until we land, you will provide Emily with the exact same level of service as every other first-class passenger. Every perk. The moment she blinks, you'll be there. Do you understand? Humiliation burned her, hot and bitter. Yes, sir, she managed, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Good. The line went dead. She lowered the phone. As she crossed the threshold, dozens of eyes pinned her in place. Passengers who had barely glanced at her before now followed her with sharp focus. Some hid behind screens, stealing furtive glances. Others stared openly, their mouths twitching with curiosity or judgment. The air hummed with whispers, the faint scent of coffee mingling with the palpable tension. Emily sat in her seat, flipping through a magazine with maddening calm. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge Miss Carter's presence, but that was the point. She was letting her stew, letting the pressure build. And it was working. Miss Carter swallowed the lump in her throat and approached, her voice as stiff as cardboard. Mrs. Williams, can I offer you a drink? A snack, perhaps? Emily didn't answer immediately. She flipped a page, the rustle echoing in the strained silence, then finally raised her eyes. Offer me a drink? She said, one eyebrow arched. Miss Carter forced a smile, her cheeks flushed. Yes, ma'am. What can I get for you? Juice, soda, tea? Emily tilted her head, her gaze piercing through the facade. You didn't ask me that before. Miss Carter froze. Nearby passengers shifted, ears perked like wolves scenting blood. When I sat down, Emily pressed, her voice even but laced with steel, you didn't offer me anything. Didn't even greet me like the others. You assumed I didn't belong here, because of how I look, isn't that right? She glanced around the cabin, daring anyone to pretend they hadn't heard. Shame hit Miss Carter like a physical blow, raw and stinging. She had no excuses, no shields. I apologize if I wasn't as prompt as I should have been, she stammered. I didn't mean any offense. Emily regarded her, then shrugged. Soda water. Miss Carter nodded quickly, desperate to escape. She hurried toward the galley, her hands shaking as she poured the drink, the bubbles hissing like her frayed nerves. Sarah watched, arms still crossed. Not looking too hot, are you? Sarah said, her voice soft but laced with a smirk. Miss Carter's jaw tightened. I don't need your commentary. Sarah's lips curved. You keep telling yourself that, but you keep proving me wrong. Miss Carter ignored her, clutching the tray like a lifeline as she returned to Emily's side. She placed the glass carefully. Here you are, ma'am. Emily took a slow sip, then looked up, her tone casual but laced with menace. Oh, by the way, I texted my husband about you. Miss Carter's stomach lurched. She tried to keep her expression neutral. I see. Emily leaned back, radiating quiet power. He's not happy. Miss Carter needed no reminder, she had felt James's wrath through the phone. But Emily's calm delivery made the knife twist deeper. Let's just see what happens when we land, Emily said, taking another sip, her eyes never leaving Miss Carter. Miss Carter nodded stiffly and retreated to the galley, her pulse pounding. The cabin, once her domain, now felt like a trap closing in. The flight wasn't over, but her reckoning had begun, and she knew the worst was yet to come. Lena glanced toward the front of the plane, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone. If you think Julian Williams is the only one you have to worry about, you're mistaken. Emily felt the air in her lungs constrict, her stomach twisting with dread. She barely processed the words as Lena glanced around the cabin, where passengers had begun to murmur. I just overheard the captain on the radio. Corporate is preparing a statement. Emily's heart seemed to stop. A wave of cold washed over her, and the truth began to sink in. This wasn't just about facing a review anymore. This was bigger, much bigger than she could have imagined. She took a breath, feeling the weight pressing down on her chest. You should think about what you're going to say when we land, Lena warned, her voice losing its previous sharpness, now revealing a hint of apprehension. Emily didn't respond. What could she say? What was the point of saying anything anymore? She stood there, motionless, finding no words. A flight that started so simply was now spiraling out of control. Back in first class, Emily's mind raced. The passengers who had been silent while Miss Carter had insulted her, now looked at her with different eyes. They hadn't known who she was at first, but now? Now they knew the truth, and the shift in their gazes made her feel suffocated. Across from her, Mr. Calloway, an older businessman, cleared his throat, clearly flustered. I hope everything has been resolved, he mumbled hesitantly. Emily turned to him, her expression cool. It will be, she replied shortly, then looked back at her phone, letting the silence amplify his discomfort. Her phone vibrated again. It was Julian. Landing in 30 minutes. Stay put. Emily gave a small grim smile. She would stay put, because she knew Miss Carter's day was only about to get worse. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that the plane was beginning its descent. Emily glanced toward the galley. Miss Carter remained out of sight, avoiding the inevitable. Emily knew why. When the plane landed, Miss Carter wouldn't be disembarking as usual. She was about to face the consequences of her actions. Her phone vibrated again. Security is waiting at the gate. Stay in your seat when the doors open. Emily's smile turned more predatory. Miss Carter had spent the flight believing she was in control. Now she was about to learn what it felt like to have no power at all. Emily's heart pounded as the plane began its descent into Denver. The shift in air pressure in the cabin felt like a reflection of her emotions. There was no turning back. Miss Carter had made a grave mistake and now everyone would know. In the galley, Miss Carter stood frozen, her hands gripping the counter, her eyes staring at her reflection in the small, stainless steel panel. She was no longer the confident woman who had controlled everything. She felt her career slipping through her fingers like sand. She had humiliated Emily, a woman who had the power to make her pay. Her fingers trembled as she tried to smooth her uniform. She needed to regain her composure. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to salvage something. But before she could convince herself, her phone vibrated. A wave of cold washed over her. "This is Miss Carter," she said, her voice trembling. The voice on the other end was stern and professional. "Miss Carter, as per directives from the board, you are to deplane last. Do not leave the aircraft until escorted. Do you understand?" Miss Carter's stomach twisted. Deplane last? Escorted? She gripped the phone tighter, her mind reeling. I don't understand. "This isn't a request," the officer's voice was firm. "A meeting has been scheduled with aviation directors the moment we land. You will be escorted off the plane. Do you understand?" The cabin around her seemed to spin. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was a corporate-level response. She had lost control the moment she dismissed Emily Williams. Now the entire plane would witness it. The call ended with a cold click. Lena watched her again, her eyes observant. "You look green," Lena said softly, but there was something deeper in her tone. Miss Carter turned away, trying to mask the panic rising within her. "I'm fine," she whispered, even though she knew it was an unconvincing lie. The plane landed, the wheels hitting the tarmac with a gentle bump, but the atmosphere in first class shifted, thick with tension. It was no longer a flight. It was now a waiting room to witness the aftermath. Emily remained still, outwardly calm, but her heart beat faster as she sensed the eyes of the other passengers on her. She noticed that they looked at her differently now. They had been silent when Miss Carter had thrown water in her face. But now that they knew who she was, now that they realized the gravity of the situation, they couldn't help but stare. Her phone vibrated again. "Security is waiting at the gate. Stay in your seat." Emily's smile deepened. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment Miss Carter realized that this world wasn't hers to control anymore. The plane came to a stop, the seatbelt sign flicking off. The usual rush to disembark didn't happen in first class. They lingered, waited. They knew what was coming next. As the jet bridge connected to the plane, a security officer stepped aboard. He scanned the cabin, walking directly toward Emily. "Ms. Williams, welcome to Denver," the officer said with a polite nod. "Let us know if you need anything." Emily nodded, giving a small, gracious smile. "Thank you." The officer turned toward the galley. "Miss Carter." Every eye turned toward her. Miss Carter emerged from the galley, her face ashen, each step faltering as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. This was no longer private. This was public. People were murmuring and staring, her humiliation laid bare. The security officer didn't touch her, but his presence was enough to convey the message. "You need to come with us." Everyone in the first-class cabin watched her, some turning away, some unable to look away, but no one indifferent anymore. Miss Carter felt her breath catch as she walked down the aisle, each step feeling like the weight of her past actions crashing down on her. Emily watched, her expression unchanged. She wasn't gloating, wasn't sneering. She was simply letting Miss Carter feel the full weight of her actions. As Miss Carter stepped off the plane, her humiliation palpable, Emily finally exhaled in relief, sinking back into her seat. She hadn't felt this calm the entire flight. Really hurt, Emily's chest warmed. Julian Williams hadn't just addressed the problem. He had changed the system so that things like that didn't happen again. She smiled, linking her arm with his. You really don't like loose ends, do you? He smirked. Not when they involve my wife. The car door opened, and as they stepped inside, Emily leaned back against the soft leather, exhaling as if it were the first time she had been able to do so since the plane had taken off. Miss Carter was gone, the flight was over, and somewhere in the sky, a new policy was being written to ensure that the next Emily Williams wouldn't need a powerful husband to be treated with respect. That was justice. The car pulled smoothly away from the airport, merging into the traffic, while the airport receded behind them. Emily rested her head against the seat, feeling the weight of everything gradually lift. The tension she had carried since that moment in the air now dissipated, replaced by a sense of calm, of resolution, the knowledge that justice had been served. Julian sat beside her, one arm resting casually on the back of the seat, the other still holding his phone, his sharp eyes scanning the barrage of emails and notifications pouring in, his fingers moving efficiently as he tackled work with the quiet dominance he always possessed. But Emily could feel it, he was still angry not just about what had happened to her, but about why it had happened. She tilted her head slightly, watching him for a moment. What are you thinking about? Julian didn't look up immediately. He finished typing something, then locked his phone and set it down beside him. When he finally met her eyes, his expression was unreadable. I'm thinking about how many times that flight attendant has done something like that before, he said evenly. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around her abdomen. Julian continued, his voice dropping lower. How many times has she treated someone like that without facing any consequences? Emily sighed, probably more than we want to know. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. She only changed her tune when she realized who you were. That's what I can't stand. If you were someone else, someone without connections, without power, she wouldn't have hesitated to humiliate you. Emily nodded slowly, she had been thinking the same thing. Julian shook his head, his jaw tight. People like her think they can get away with it because most of the time they do. She probably thought she could talk to you like that because she's done it before and no one has said anything. Emily sighed, rubbing slow circles on her stomach. Well, she's been checked now. Julian's gaze flickered to her stomach, his expression softening slightly, but the tension remained in his body as he agreed. But that's not enough. Emily smiled knowingly. That's why you didn't just fire her, right? Julian's lips quirked in a faint smile. You know me too well. Julian Williams wasn't the type to simply punish someone and move on. He changed things. Emily sat up a little straighter. What else are you planning to do? Julian's smile faded as his expression turned serious. I'm making sure this doesn't happen again. Not just to you but to anyone. He picked up his phone again, swiping through an email before showing it to her. Emily's eyebrows rose as she scanned the screen. New company directive, immediate investigation into passenger treatment in first class. Her lips parted slightly as she read the internal memo, outlining a comprehensive audit of the airline's customer service standards. This is going to be on all flights? She asked. Julian nodded. Every flight, every crew, every attendant. I want to know if this was an isolated incident or part of a larger problem. Emily glanced at him, impressed. And if it's a larger problem? Julian's expression darkened. We'll fix it. There was no hesitation in. Emily reached over and took his hand, squeezing it tight. That's why you're the best at this. Julian chuckled softly, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a light kiss to the back of it. I don't know if I'm the best, but I do know one thing. He smirked again. I do enjoy watching you make arrogant people squirm. Emily giggled, shaking her head. I didn't do anything. You did, Julian said. You stood your ground, you made her admit her mistake, and the way you made her flinch before taking the water. That was artistry. Emily smiled, leaning back in her seat. She deserved worse. Julian's expression turned slightly darker. She did. Emily sighed. But the truth is, I don't want to spend another second thinking about her. She's not important. She's not worth our time. Julian looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Okay. She smiled, squeezing his hand again. I just want to go home, put my feet up, and eat something high in calories and unhealthy. Julian chuckled softly. Okay. He tapped the screen of the car's communication system. Take us home and stop at that seafood place Emily likes. Emily sighed contentedly, already picturing the crispy fried shrimp and fries that awaited her. The day had started with humiliation, but it was ending as it should, with her at peace and Miss Carter out of a job. Honestly, it was a happy ending she could get used to. The car glided through the city streets, the engine humming softly in the background. Outside, Denver buzzed with life, pedestrians, bright billboards, the evening air thick with energy, but inside the car there was only peace. Emily rested her head against the seat, her hand unconsciously stroking her belly. The baby had been active throughout the flight, but now she could finally feel the little kicks subsiding. Maybe the baby was also sensing the shift from tension to peace. Julian glanced at her, his sharp eyes softening as he watched her relax. "Long day," he murmured. Emily smiled faintly, tilting her head toward him. An understatement. Julian reached over and took her hand, his hand warm, solid. "I hated that this happened," he said, his voice now softer. "I hated that you had to sit there and endure that." Emily squeezed his hand, her fingers tracing over his knuckles. "I've endured worse." Julian's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening slightly. "You shouldn't have to." Emily sighed, turning her gaze to the window. "But we do." Julian was silent because he knew this wasn't just about one flight attendant with an inflated sense of self-importance. This was about a system that made people like Miss Carter feel untouchable. A system that allowed people like Emily to be overlooked, disrespected, to have their place questioned in spaces where they belonged. Julian didn't believe in just fixing individual problems. He believed in tearing down the entire system and building something better. It was why Emily had fallen in love with him in the first place. She turned back to him, watching the way his fingers unconsciously tapped against the leather seat, clearly still thinking. "What are you planning?" "You can't fix everything," Emily said. Julian quirked an eyebrow, tilting his head toward her. "Watch me." Emily giggled, shaking her head. "You're such a drama queen." His smile widened. "And you love it." She sighed but couldn't argue because he was right. The car slowed as they approached their first stop, a high-end seafood dive, the kind of place where the food was greasy but the ambience was classy enough to make you feel like you were eating in a fancy restaurant. Julian's driver pulled the car to the curb, and in a matter of seconds, a server appeared with a takeout bag at the ready. Emily blinked. "You all ready?" Julian winked. "Had them start cooking as soon as we landed." She smiled. "That's why I married you." Julian chuckled, accepting the bag of food from the server and handing it to her. "I thought you married me for my charm." Emily opened the container, inhaling the scent of buttery fried shrimp and perfectly salted fries. She sighed in contentment. "Nope, I married you for this." Julian shook his head, laughing out loud, but his eyes were soft as he watched her. The car pulled away again, heading toward home, and for the first time that day, Emily felt completely at peace. The earlier humiliation was gone, the frustration was dealt with, and Miss Carter? She was just a memory. Because when Emily woke up tomorrow she would wake up to life as usual, but Miss Carter, she would wake up to a life in shambles. And honestly, Emily didn't feel a single bit of regret. The city lights blurred past the window as the car navigated the streets. The smooth hum of the engine blended into the quiet within the car. Emily curled her legs beneath her, already plucking a crispy fried shrimp from the takeout container. The rich flavor danced on her tongue, and for the first time all day, Emily felt completely relaxed. Julian watched her, an amused smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You look like you just won something," he said. Emily raised an eyebrow, popping a fry into her mouth. "I did. I got my nap, I got my justice, and now I got fried food. That's the holy trinity." Julian chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're incorrigible." Emily grinned, licking a bit of sauce off her finger. "And you still married me." His smirk widened. "Best decision I ever made." She rolled her eyes, but her gaze was full of warmth. As the car turned onto their street, Emily glanced down at her phone, a few unread messages appearing in her notifications, but one in particular caught her eye, a forwarded email from Julian's executive assistant. She frowned slightly and opened it. As her eyes scanned the subject line, a slow, satisfied smile spread across her face. Subject: Termination notice for Marla Carter. Emily let out a pleased, angling her phone slightly so Julian could see. "Looks like it's official," she said, her eyes sparkling. Julian gave the email a cursory glance, then leaned back against the seat. It was officially done the moment she was escorted off the plane. Emily giggled, shaking her head. "You don't play fair, do you?" Julian stretched, radiating easy confidence, the kind that made him dangerous in a boardroom. "I play to win." She studied him. "So what did you win?" Julian reached over, plucked the last fry from her container, popped it into his mouth, chewing slowly before looking at her with a smug glint in his eye. "You." Julian stared at her for another moment before finally nodding, releasing her hand and stepping out of the car, walking around to open her door for her. Emily laughed. I can open my own door. He smirked. I know, but I prefer to do it. She rolled her eyes but stepped out, inhaling the cool night air. The tension of the flight, of Miss Carter, of the whole tiring situation, it all melted away. Home, that was all that mattered now. Julian guided her up the steps, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back as they entered the house. The familiar scent of lavender and warm vanilla greeted them. Their home was modern, sleek but not cold. It was a space that felt lived in, comfortable, full of life. Emily kicked off her shoes, sighing in relief as she collapsed onto the sofa. Julian loosened his tie, watching her with amusement. You look like you just melted into the furniture. I did, she murmured, stretching out. This couch loves me and I love it. Julian chuckled, disappearing into the kitchen for a moment before returning with a bottle of water, handing it to her, then settling down beside her. His arm draped across the back of the couch. For a long moment they sat in silence, no drama, no tension, just peace. Finally Emily sighed. Today was insane. Julian smirked. Yeah, and you still made it look easy. She glanced at him, her eyes full of amusement. I made it look easy? Julian nodded, his expression serious. You handled that flight attendant better than most people handle a boardroom meeting. Emily giggled. I wasn't trying to do anything. I just didn't want to let her win. Julian's smile faded slightly, his eyes turning thoughtful. You didn't just win. You made sure she won't do that to anyone else again. Emily's lips parted, she hadn't thought of it that way. She had been so focused on getting through the situation, on not letting it get to her. But she realized that her standing up for herself had changed something, not just for her, but for anyone who might have been in her position. Julian took her hand again, lacing their fingers together. I'm thinking, he said, maybe I should make you head of customer service. Emily chuckled, shaking her head. I'd fire half the staff in a week. Julian laughed out loud. And I would back every single one of those firings. She sighed, resting her head on his shoulder. No more flight talk, at least for a week. Julian pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Deal. She closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion wash over her. She was home, safe, loved, and Miss Carter, Carter was somewhere trying to salvage her career. Justice had been served, and Emily, she was completely free to rest. People think they can treat others however they want until they face the consequences. What do you think? Was justice served? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories like this. If you love this story, don't miss part 2. The story still has many surprises in store, and Emily will face new challenges. Will she continue to fight for justice? Or are there plots lurking behind the important decisions she has to make? Stay tuned for part 2 to discover the next dramatic, intense situations. Don't forget to follow so you don't miss it.